The wedding dress still carried the scent of lavender when they abandoned Rachel. She sat motionless in the vast banquet hall, white lace cascading over chrome wheels, watching the last guests slip through the double doors like ghosts fleeing daylight. 8 months since the crash had stolen her legs, and now her fiancé had chosen his reputation over his vows, his family's voices still echoing off the walls. A burden for life. The venue coordinator dimmed the chandeliers without a word, her pity worse than any insult. Then footsteps approached through the silence. A man with sawdust on his worn jacket and a small boy gripping his hand appeared from the shadows. The child's eyes held no pity, only quiet curiosity. The stranger didn't ask permission. He simply knelt to Rachel's level, his calloused fingers steady on the armrest, and spoke words that would shatter everything she thought she knew about being broken. "You don't belong in here alone." What followed wasn't charity, wasn't rescue, wasn't anything the world would call noble. It was a reckoning neither of them saw coming, and the price he would pay for staying would test everything he had left to give. The truth about what this man did will change everything, but the price he paid will shock even more. The ballroom had been decorated for joy. White roses climbed the pillars, their petals already browning at the edges. Crystal vases reflected fragments of Rachel's face. Eyes rimmed red, mascara tracked down pale cheeks, lips pressed into a thin line that trembled when she tried to hold still. The cake sat untouched on its table, 3 tiers of buttercream and fondant flowers that nobody would eat. She'd chosen the flavor herself, months ago when walking had been something she did without thinking, when the biggest worry in her life had been whether to wear her hair up or down. Now the wheelchair's armrests dug into her palms as she gripped them, knuckles white, trying to remember how to breathe through the humiliation that filled her lungs like water. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. Rachel remembered that detail with cruel clarity. Tuesday morning, 8 months and 4 days ago, when a delivery truck ran a red light and turned her small sedan into twisted metal. She'd woken in the hospital to fluorescent lights and the doctor's careful voice explaining words like spinal cord injury and incomplete paralysis and physical therapy. Her fiancé Bradford had held her hand through those first terrible weeks, had promised nothing would change, had kissed her forehead and sworn they'd face it together. But promises, Rachel learned, were easier to make in hospital rooms than to keep in the harsh light of reality. Bradford's mother had started first, her voice dripping with concern that barely masked disgust. "We just want what's best for Bradford's future," she'd said, eyes sliding away from the wheelchair as if looking directly at it might be contagious. His father had been blunter during their last conversation, the one Bradford hadn't known Rachel overheard. "Son, you're 28 years old. You can't tie yourself to a cripple for life. Think about your career, your reputation. What will people say?" Bradford had been silent for a long time. That silence had told Rachel everything she needed to know, but still she'd hoped, still she'd believed love might be stronger than shame. She'd been wrong. This morning, 3 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Bradford had found her in the bridal suite. She'd been sitting in her wheelchair, already dressed, the white gown they'd modified to accommodate her condition pooling around the chrome frame. He couldn't look at her face when he spoke. "I can't do this, Rachel. I'm sorry. I thought I could, but I can't." The door had closed softly behind him. No fight, no tears, just the quiet click of a lock and the sound of her own breathing in the empty room. His family had paid for the venue, had invited the guests, had controlled every detail of the wedding they'd wanted. They'd made the announcement over the phone. The bride was ill. The ceremony postponed indefinitely. No further questions, please. The guests had left in clusters, some looking relieved, others uncomfortable, none brave enough to stay and ask if Rachel needed anything. Now she sat alone in the aftermath, surrounded by decorations that mocked her with their cheerful colors. The venue coordinator, a woman in her 50s with efficient hands and kind eyes, had approached once to ask if Rachel needed help, if there was someone she could call. Rachel had shaken her head, voice scraped raw. "Just give me a minute. I'll leave soon." The woman had nodded, retreated to her office, and left Rachel to her vigil in the empty hall. The silence pressed against her eardrums, thick and suffocating. She'd lost so much already. Her mobility, her job teaching piano at the community center, her independence, the casual ease of a body that obeyed her commands. Now she'd lost the future she'd imagined, the man she'd thought loved her, the illusion that she was still the same person she'd been before the crash. The footsteps startled her. Heavy boots on polished floor, purposeful but unhurried. Rachel's head snapped up, expecting the coordinator returning to hurry her along. Instead, a man emerged from the hallway that led to the kitchen entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going grey at the temples and carpenter's hands that showed years of hard work. Sawdust clung to his faded denim jacket. A boy walked beside him, small hand engulfed in the man's larger one, 6 years old maybe, with tousled brown hair and eyes that studied Rachel with the unfiltered honesty only children possessed. They shouldn't have been here. The venue was closed, the doors locked to anyone but staff. Yet here they stood, and something in the man's face, not pity, not curiosity, but a strange recognition, made Rachel's throat tighten. "You're the bride," the man said. Not a question. His voice was rough, unused to unnecessary words. Rachel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The boy tugged his father's hand. "Dad, why is she crying?" The man knelt beside his son, eye level now, and spoke quietly. "Because sometimes people get hurt in ways that don't show on the outside, Finn, and that kind of hurt can be the worst kind." He straightened, took 3 steps forward, and knelt again, this time beside Rachel's wheelchair, his calloused fingers resting light on the armrest, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You don't belong in here alone," he said. Rachel's voice came out broken. "You don't know anything about me." The man's expression didn't change. "I know you're sitting in a wedding dress in an empty ballroom. I know whoever was supposed to be here with you isn't, and I know that look in your eyes, the one that says you're trying to figure out if it's worth getting up tomorrow." He stood, held out his hand. "My name's Caleb. This is my son, Finn. My truck's out back. Let me take you home." Rachel stared at his outstretched palm, rough with calluses and old scars, steady as stone. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to preserve what little dignity she had left, to not become some stranger's charity project. But the alternative was calling a taxi, wheeling herself out past the venue coordinator's pitying eyes, returning to her empty apartment where the walls closed in and the silence screamed. She took his hand. His grip was warm, firm without being crushing, and when he helped guide her wheelchair toward the exit, his movements showed a practiced ease that made her wonder. Finn walked ahead, chattering about a bird's nest he'd seen that morning, his voice a bright counterpoint to the darkness Rachel felt pressing down on her shoulders. Caleb's truck was old, well-maintained, but showing its years, with a liftgate attachment welded to the back that unfolded with a mechanical hum. "Built it myself," Caleb said, answering the question Rachel hadn't asked. "My wife needed it." Needed. Past tense. Rachel wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. And Caleb didn't elaborate. He secured her wheelchair with straps that showed signs of heavy use, their edges frayed but functional, and closed the gate with a gentleness that contrasted with his rough appearance. The drive passed in silence, broken only by Finn's occasional observations about passing cars or interesting clouds. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, jaw set in a way that suggested he was a man used to carrying weight. Rachel watched the city slide past her window. Storefronts and traffic lights, and people walking on sidewalks, all of them moving through their lives with an ease she'd taken for granted for 26 years. The wheelchair had become her world, its boundaries absolute, and she hated how small her universe had become. When Caleb pulled up to a modest house on a quiet street, trees overgrown and paint peeling on the porch railings, Rachel felt something crack in her chest. "This isn't my address," she said. Caleb cut the engine. "Didn't ask for your address. You need somewhere that isn't empty right now. This is somewhere." The house smelled like sawdust and coffee, and something baking. Bread, maybe, or cookies. Caleb lowered the liftgate, wheeled Rachel up a ramp that had clearly been built with care, each board sanded smooth and sealed against weather. Inside, the living room was clean, but cluttered with the debris of a life being lived. Finn's toys scattered on the rug, a stack of library books on the coffee table, a framed photograph on the mantel that Rachel's eyes snagged on before she could stop herself. A woman, dark-haired and laughing, sitting in a wheelchair identical to the one Rachel occupied now. Caleb saw her looking. "My wife, Helen," he said quietly. "She passed 2 years ago. Cancer." Rachel's breath stuttered. "She was paralyzed?" Caleb nodded, moving to the kitchen to pour water into a kettle. "Car accident, 5 years before she got sick. We managed. You learn to adapt." Finn had disappeared down the hallway, and now he returned dragging a blanket covered in stars and moons. He climbed onto the couch beside Rachel's chair and spread the blanket over her lap with the serious concentration of a child performing an important task. "You're cold," he announced. Rachel hadn't realized she was shivering until the weight of the fabric settled over her legs that could feel pressure, but not temperature, that responded to some commands but refused others in the random cruelty of nerve damage. "Thank you," she whispered. Finn beamed. "Are you going to stay with us?" Caleb turned from the stove, about to intervene, but Rachel spoke first. "Just for a little while," she heard herself say, surprising herself with the words. "Just until I figure out what comes next." What came next was 3 days of careful silence. Caleb left early each morning for his carpentry work, projects that took him to construction sites across the city. Finn attended first grade at the elementary school 3 blocks away, walking there each morning with his backpack bouncing against his small shoulders. Rachel spent the hours alone in Caleb's living room, surrounded by evidence of a life that had learned to accommodate tragedy and kept moving forward anyway. The first day she barely moved from where Caleb had positioned her chair, shame and exhaustion pinning her in place. The second day she found the courage to explore, wheeling herself through the small house, discovering the kitchen with its lowered countertops and pull-out shelves, the bathroom with grab bars and a roll-in shower, the bedroom that had clearly been Helen's. Caleb still slept on the couch, Rachel realized, unable or unwilling to reclaim that space. On the third day, Rachel found the garage. The door had been slightly ajar, and curiosity pulled her forward, despite the voice in her head that whispered about boundaries and price of embarrassing. Inside, among the smell of cut wood and motor oil, sat another wheelchair, older than hers, its fabric worn thin in places, one wheel showing a long scratch down the chrome. Beside it, a shelf held medical supplies still in their packaging, compression socks and disposable gloves and bottles of lotion for preventing bed sores. Books lined a workbench, their spines creased from repeated reading. Caregiving for spinal cord injuries. Living with paralysis. When someone you love can't walk. Rachel's hands trembled on her wheels. This wasn't just knowledge Caleb had acquired. This was a life he'd lived, day after day, year after year, until cancer had taken Helen and left him with expertise nobody wanted and memories that lined every corner of this house. She was still sitting there, staring at Helen's wheelchair, when Caleb found her that evening. He stood in the doorway, still in his work clothes, sawdust in his hair, and fatigue in the set of his shoulders. "I should have put that away," he said quietly. Rachel shook her head. "Why did you bring me here?" The question had been building for 3 days, pressing against her ribs, demanding release. "You don't know me. I could be anyone. Why would you do this?" Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, and for a long moment he didn't speak. When he did, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned understanding. "Because I know what it's like to watch someone you love lose themselves. Not to the injury. Helen never lost herself to the wheelchair, but to the way people looked at her after, like she'd stopped being a person and become a problem to solve. I watched her shrink under those looks, watched her apologize for existing, watched her try to make herself smaller so other people would be more comfortable." He pushed off the doorframe, took 3 steps into the garage, and his hand came to rest on Helen's old wheelchair, fingers tracing the scratch on the chrome with the tenderness of ritual. She got better at it, eventually. Learned to take up space again, learned to tell people to deal with their own discomfort. But it took time, and it took having people around her who saw her first, chair second. You had that look in your eyes at the venue, that look that says you're trying to figure out how to disappear. I couldn't walk away from that. Rachel's throat closed around words she didn't have, emotions she couldn't name. "Your neighbors," she managed finally. "I heard them talking yesterday when I was by the window. They said you were starting again. They didn't sound approving." Caleb's jaw tightened, the only sign the words had landed. "Let them talk. They talked when Helen was alive too, made assumptions about what we could and couldn't do, offered sympathy we didn't ask for, and judgment we didn't need. People are going to think what they want to think. Doesn't make it true. Doesn't make it my problem." He met Rachel's eyes, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "You're not a project, Rachel. You're not charity. You're someone who needed a place to catch your breath, and I had space to offer. That's all this is." But even as he said it, both of them knew it wasn't entirely true. Something else hummed in the air between them, something neither was ready to name, a recognition that went deeper than circumstance and cut closer to the bone than either was comfortable admitting. The next 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to normal. Rachel started helping with small things, folding Finn's laundry from her chair, reviewing his homework at the kitchen table, teaching him simple songs on the upright piano that sat against the living room wall, its keys yellow with age, but still mostly in tune. She learned that Caleb took his coffee, black and strong, that he worked with his hands when worry kept him awake, that he never talked about Helen directly, but spoke to her memory in the way he moved through the house, touching door frames she'd touched, sitting in the chair she'd favored, keeping her garden alive in the small plot behind the house. Finn filled the spaces between with his endless questions and observations, his presence a bright thread stitching them together into something that almost resembled a family. But tension built beneath the surface like pressure behind a dam. Rachel's physical therapist called twice, leaving messages about missed appointments and the importance of maintaining her exercise regimen. Her apartment lease was coming due, decisions needed to be made, and she couldn't hide in Caleb's house forever pretending the outside world had stopped existing. One morning, 3 weeks after the wedding that, never happened, Rachel wheeled herself to the kitchen to find Caleb already up, coffee untouched on the counter, staring at something on his phone with an expression that made her stomach drop. "What's wrong?" He looked up, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw genuine anger in his face. "Bradford posted an announcement. He's engaged. To someone else. One of his co-workers, apparently. The wedding's set for next month." The words hit like a physical blow. 3 weeks. It had taken her former fiancé 3 weeks to move on, to find someone else, to prove that everything they'd had, 3 years of dating, a year of engagement, all those promises and plans, meant exactly as much as she'd feared it did. Which was nothing. Rachel's hands clenched in her lap, fingernails biting into her palms hard enough to leave crescents. "Let me see." Caleb hesitated, then handed her the phone. The photo showed Bradford in a suit, arm around a woman Rachel vaguely recognized from his office Christmas party. Blonde, smiling, standing on legs that worked exactly the way legs were supposed to work. The caption read, "Sometimes life redirects you to where you were meant to be all along. Can't wait to marry this amazing woman." Rachel handed the phone back, her hand steady even as her vision blurred. "I'm glad," she said, and was surprised to find she almost meant it. "I'm glad I found out now instead of 5 years from now when I'd wasted even more time believing his promises." Caleb's expression softened. "You're allowed to be angry, Rachel. You're allowed to feel however you feel about this." She shook her head. "I'm not angry. I'm grateful. He did me a favor, really. Showed me exactly who he was when it mattered." But even as she said it, old fears clawed their way up her throat, the ones that whispered in the dark hours of sleepless nights. Damaged goods. Used up. Not worth the effort. Burden, burden, burden. That afternoon, while Finn was at school, Rachel's phone rang. She'd been avoiding calls for weeks, but this one showed her mother's number, and guilt finally outweighed avoidance. Her mother's voice came through sharp with worry that Rachel had learned long ago masked fear. "Rachel Marie, where have you been? I've been calling for weeks. Bradford's mother said the wedding was postponed, but nobody would tell me anything else. And then I saw his engagement announcement, and I didn't know what to think." Rachel cut her off. "The wedding wasn't postponed, Mom. It was cancelled. Bradford decided he couldn't marry someone in a wheelchair, so he left." Silence stretched over the line, long enough that Rachel checked to make sure they hadn't been disconnected. When her mother spoke again, her voice had gone quiet, dangerous. "That boy and his family are going to regret this. I always said there was something weak about him." Rachel closed her eyes. "Mom, I don't need you to be angry on my behalf. I just need—" But she didn't know what she needed. Space? Time? Proof that she was still someone worth keeping? Her mother, with the intuition mothers possessed, asked the question Rachel had been dreading. "Where are you staying? Are you back at your apartment?" Rachel glanced around Caleb's living room, at Finn's toys and the photograph of Helen and the piano she'd been teaching herself to play again. "I'm staying with a friend. Someone who's helping me figure things out." Another pause. "What kind of friend?" The suspicion in her mother's voice made Rachel's shoulders tense. "A good one, Mom. Someone who understands what I'm going through. That's all you need to know right now." The conversation ended shortly after, both of them unsatisfied. Too much left unsaid. Rachel sat in the quiet house, afternoon light slanting through the windows, dust motes drifting in the golden beams. She thought about Bradford and his new fiancé, about the life she'd almost had, about the person she'd been before the accident. Confident, independent, certain of her place in the world. That person felt like a stranger now, someone Rachel had been acquainted with but never truly known. The crash hadn't just taken her legs. It had stripped away every illusion about who loved her and why, had revealed the conditional nature of every relationship she'd built, had forced her to see herself through eyes that measured worth by ability and value by convenience. Finn burst through the front door at 3:15, backpack flying, announcing at top volume that his class had hatched butterflies and one of them had landed on his finger during recess. Caleb followed more slowly, his shirt marked with paint stains, a cut on his forearm that he waved off when Rachel's eyes caught on it. "Just a scratch," Hazard of the job. They made dinner together, Caleb cooking while Finn talked, and Rachel set the table from her chair, arranging plates and silverware with the precision of someone trying to prove her usefulness. They ate, and Finn chatted about butterflies and metamorphosis, how caterpillars dissolved completely inside their cocoons before becoming something new, how the teachers said it was like magic, but it was really science. After Finn went to bed, Rachel and Caleb sat in the living room, him in Helen's favorite chair, her in her wheelchair by the window, both of them pretending to read while really just existing in the same space, comfortable enough with silence that words weren't necessary. But tonight, Rachel needed words. "Caleb," she said quietly, "why do you still sleep on the couch?" He looked up from his book, surprise flickering across his face at the directness of the question. "It's Helen's room," he said simply. "Doesn't feel right to take it back." Rachel set down her own book. "She's been gone 2 years. At some point, you have to let yourself live again." The irony of her giving advice about moving forward wasn't lost on either of them, and Caleb's slight smile acknowledged it. "You're right," he said. "I know you're right. But knowing something and doing something are different animals." He closed his book, set it aside, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "After Helen died, Finn asked me when she was coming back. He was 4. Didn't really understand what forever meant. I told him Mom had gone somewhere she couldn't come back from, but that she was still with us in all the ways that mattered, in the garden she planted, in the songs she used to sing, in the way we took care of each other. He seemed to accept that, but I'm not sure I ever did." His voice dropped lower. "Some days I still expect to hear her wheelchair in the hallway, still set the table for 3 before I remember. Grief is funny that way. It tricks you into believing the impossible." Rachel wheeled herself closer, reached out, and covered his hand with hers, the first time she'd initiated touch, and she felt him go still beneath her fingers. "I'm sorry," she said, "for your loss, for all of it." Caleb turned his hand over, laced his fingers through hers, and the contact sent heat up her arm that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the attraction she'd been trying to ignore for weeks. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Helen gave me 7 good years. She taught me more about strength and courage than I'd learned in 30 years before her. And Finn," his voice caught. "She gave me Finn. And he's the best part of me. I'm not sorry for any of it, even knowing how it ended." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and weighted with everything they weren't saying. Then Finn's voice called from down the hall. "Dad, I had a bad dream." And Caleb pulled away, the spell broken. "I should—" Rachel nodded. "Go. He needs you." After Caleb disappeared down the hallway, Rachel sat alone in the living room, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart doing complicated things in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. She'd come here broken, convinced she was nothing more than the sum of her limitations, certain that Bradford's rejection had proven something fundamental about her worth. But 3 weeks in Caleb's house had planted seeds of doubt in that certainty. Maybe she was more than her wheelchair. Maybe worth wasn't measured in mobility. Maybe love looked different than she'd always imagined. The following week brought unexpected visitors. Rachel was practicing piano, working through a simple melody her fingers still remembered, when the doorbell rang. Caleb was at work, Finn at school, and Rachel hesitated before wheeling herself to the door. Through the window she could see 2 women she didn't recognize, one holding a casserole dish. She opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman with the casserole smiled, but something in it set Rachel's teeth on edge. Too bright, too interested. "We're Caleb's neighbors. Brenda from next door, and this is Patricia from across the street. We wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." Rachel wasn't a fool. She recognized a reconnaissance mission when she saw one. That's kind of you, Rachel said carefully. But I'm not moving in. I'm just staying here temporarily. Brenda's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. Oh? That's not what we heard. We thought maybe Caleb had finally decided to… Well, we don't want to presume, but after Helen, we wondered if he'd ever… She trailed off meaningfully. Patricia jumped in. We just worry about him, you understand. He's such a good man, and he's been alone so long. We wouldn't want to see him taken advantage of. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Rachel felt anger spark in her chest, hot and clarifying. I'm not taking advantage of anyone. Caleb offered me a place to stay when I needed it. That's called kindness, not exploitation. Brenda's smile didn't waver. Of course, dear. We didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that, well, you're in a wheelchair, and Helen was too, and people talk. They wonder if maybe Caleb has some kind of… She paused, searching for a word. Pattern. You know how tongues wag? Rachel's hands tightened on her wheels. 7 years of teaching had given her a voice that could fill a classroom when necessary, and she used it now. No, I don't know how tongues wag, and I don't particularly care. What I do know is that Caleb is one of the finest people I've ever met, and if your idea of being a good neighbor is spreading gossip about him, then maybe you should reconsider your definition of the word good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do. She closed the door on their shocked faces, her heart hammering. She'd never been one for confrontation, had spent most of her life smoothing over conflicts and making herself agreeable. But something had shifted in the past month. Maybe it was hitting rock bottom and discovering she could survive it. Maybe it was watching Caleb live his principles instead of just speaking them. Maybe it was remembering the teacher she'd been before the accident, the one who stood up for her students and didn't back down from difficult conversations. That person had gotten buried beneath trauma and pain, but she wasn't gone. She was just sleeping, and now she was waking up angry. When Caleb came home that evening, Rachel told him about the visit. He listened, his expression darkening, then sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. They mean well, mostly, but they don't know when to mind their own business. Rachel shook her head. Don't apologize for them. But Caleb, they have a point. Not the point they think they're making, but a point nonetheless. I can't stay here forever. I need to figure out my life, and I can't do that hiding in your house. The words hurt to say, but they needed saying. Caleb's jaw tightened. You're not hiding. You're recovering. Rachel met his eyes. From what? The accident was 8 months ago. The wedding was a month ago. At some point, recovery becomes avoidance. They stared at each other across the living room, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Is that what you want? Caleb asked quietly. To leave? The question carried weight, asked more than it seemed to ask. Rachel forced herself to be honest. I don't know what I want, except… She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Except what? Caleb took a step closer. Except, I want to stop feeling like a burden. I want to wake up in the morning and not hate what I see in the mirror. I want to believe that someone could love me, not in spite of this chair, but including it, as part of the whole complicated package of who I am now. And I can't figure out how to want those things if I'm living in someone else's house, accepting someone else's kindness, existing in the margins of someone else's life. Caleb closed the distance between them, knelt beside her chair the way he had that first day in the ballroom, his eyes level with hers. You're not in the margins, Rachel. You haven't been for weeks now. His voice dropped lower, rough with something that made her pulse quicken. And for the record, nobody who matters sees you as a burden. Finn asks about you constantly. When you'll be home, what you'll make for dinner, if you'll help him with his homework. You make him laugh. You make this house feel like more than just a place we sleep." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone softer still. "And you make me remember what it feels like to want something for myself instead of just getting through another day." Rachel's breath caught. "Caleb?" He reached up, his calloused thumb brushing her cheek, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I'm not Bradford. I'm not going to promise you forever and then run when things get complicated. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't feel what I feel. And what I feel, Rachel, is that you walking into my life, or wheeling into it, was the best thing that's happened to me in 2 years. So if you want to leave because you need to find your own way, I'll help you do that. But if you're leaving because you think you're doing me a favor, then you're wrong." His hand stayed on her face, warm and steady, and Rachel found herself leaning into the touch before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of this, of you, of wanting something and having it taken away again." Caleb's smile was sad and understanding. "Welcome to being human. We're all scared of something. The question is whether the fear gets to make our decisions for us." Before Rachel could respond, Finn's voice called from the hallway. "Miss Rachel, can you help me with my math?" And the moment shattered. Caleb stood, the loss of his touch immediate and acute, and Rachel wheeled herself toward Finn's room, her thoughts in chaos and her heart doing something that felt dangerously close to hoping. The next morning brought the phone call that changed everything. Finn had been at school for an hour when the principal called Caleb's number, her voice tight with controlled urgency. Caleb listened, his expression going pale, and then he was moving, grabbing his keys, heading for the door. Rachel intercepted him. "What happened?" His hands were shaking, the first time she'd seen him lose his composure. "Finn fell on the playground. They think his arm's broken. They're calling an ambulance, but I need to get there. Rachel didn't think, just acted. "Take me with you." Caleb started to protest, but Rachel cut him off. "He's scared, Caleb. He'll be less scared if there are 2 of us. Let me help."